The wind howled across the frozen mountains of Afghanistan as Major Sarah Chun adjusted her night vision goggles. Snow pelted against the cockpit window of her Black Hawk helicopter, each flake illuminating briefly in the green glow before disappearing into the darkness. Christmas Eve 2019 had arrived with the worst blizzard the region had seen in decades, and somewhere in those treacherous peaks, 12 Navy SEALs were fighting for their lives. Sarah had been flying military helicopters for 8 years, but she had never faced conditions like this. The weather station reported winds gusting up to 70 miles per hour, with visibility near zero and temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Every other pilot on the base had already been grounded. The storm was too dangerous, they said. No aircraft could survive those conditions. But 12 American soldiers were trapped, and Sarah Chun refused to accept that they would die on Christmas Eve because everyone else was too afraid to fly. The mission had started as a routine reconnaissance operation 3 days earlier. Alpha Team, led by Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, had been deployed to gather intelligence on Taliban movements in the remote Kunar province. The 12-man team included some of the most experienced operators in the Navy, men who had completed multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were supposed to observe enemy positions for 48 hours and extract quietly without engaging. Everything had gone wrong from the beginning. The Taliban forces in the area were larger than intelligence reports had indicated. Instead of a small cell of fighters, Alpha Team discovered a major staging area with over 200 enemy combatants preparing for a coordinated assault on nearby coalition bases. The SEALs had managed to gather crucial intelligence, but their position was compromised during extraction. A firefight erupted as the team moved toward their pickup point. The Taliban had anticipated their route and set up an ambush that caught the Americans in a crossfire between two ridgelines. Lieutenant Commander Morrison made the difficult decision to break contact and move to higher ground, calling for immediate extraction while his team laid down suppressive fire. The first helicopter sent to retrieve them had been forced to abort when rocket-propelled grenades exploded around the landing zone. The pilot reported that the enemy fire was too intense and the terrain too difficult for a safe landing. A second attempt 12 hours later failed when the aircraft developed mechanical problems shortly after takeoff. Then, the storm arrived. Weather reports had predicted light snow, but the system intensified rapidly as it moved through the mountain passes. Within hours, what should have been a minor weather event became a life-threatening blizzard that grounded all aircraft in the region. The SEALs, already low on ammunition and supplies after 2 days of fighting, now faced freezing to death in temperatures that could kill an exposed human in minutes. Sarah first learned about the trap team during the evening briefing on December 23rd. Colonel Marcus Webb, the base commander, stood before a room full of pilots and explained the situation with grim efficiency. 12 SEALs were stranded on a mountain peak approximately 60 miles northeast of the base. They had established a defensive position in a cave system, but their supplies were running critically low. Medical reports indicated that at least 3 team members had suffered serious injuries during the initial firefight. The weather forecasters say the storm will continue for at least another 48 hours, Colonel Webb announced, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that could mean life or death for American soldiers. All rescue operations are suspended until conditions improve. Sarah raised her hand immediately. Sir, what about emergency extraction procedures? We have protocols for extreme weather rescues. The colonel's expression hardened. Major Chun, I understand your concern for our people, but I will not authorize a suicide mission. The weather conditions make flight operations impossible. We would only be creating more casualties. With respect, sir, those men are going to die if we don't get them out soon. They've been without resupply for 3 days, and the temperatures are dropping below survival levels. The decision is final, Major. No aircraft will be authorized for takeoff until the weather clears. But, as Sarah returned to her quarters that night, she could not stop thinking about the 12 men trapped on the mountain. She had studied the weather reports in detail, analyzing wind patterns and visibility conditions throughout the night. The storm was severe, but there might be brief windows when a skilled pilot could navigate through the worst of it. More importantly, she knew something that the weather forecasters did not fully understand. The mountain terrain in that region created unique wind patterns that could actually provide temporary shelter from the storm. During her previous deployments, Sarah had learned to read these microclimates and use them to her advantage during difficult missions. She spent hours reviewing topographical maps and satellite imagery of the area where the SEALs were trapped. The peak they had reached was accessible from the northeast, where the mountain face created a natural windbreak. If she could approach from that direction and time her arrival during a brief lull in the storm, extraction might be possible. The technical challenges would be enormous. Flying in zero visibility required complete reliance on instruments, but the mountainous terrain made instrument approaches extremely dangerous. Radio communications would be unreliable due to atmospheric interference from the storm. Landing on an unimproved surface in high winds and snow would test every skill she had developed as a pilot. But Sarah had trained for exactly these kinds of impossible missions. She had graduated at the top of her class from Army Flight School and completed advanced training in high-altitude operations and extreme weather flying. More importantly, she had grown up in Alaska, where her father had taught her to fly small aircraft in conditions that would terrify most pilots. By dawn on December 24th, Sarah had made her decision. The weather reports showed a possible break in the storm sometime around midday, when wind speeds might drop temporarily to manageable levels. If she could time her departure to coincide with that window, she might be able to reach the stranded team. The biggest obstacle would be getting authorization for the mission. Colonel Webb had explicitly forbidden any rescue attempts, and disobeying direct orders could end her military career and result in court-martial proceedings. But 12 men were dying on a mountain, and Sarah believed she had the skills to save them. She began preparing her aircraft before sunrise, conducting a thorough pre-flight inspection and reviewing all systems. Her Black Hawk, designated as Rescue 7, was one of the newer helicopters in the squadron, equipped with advanced navigation systems and cold weather modifications that would be essential for the mission. Sarah also gathered emergency medical supplies and additional survival gear that the SEALs would need for the flight back to base. She calculated fuel requirements precisely, knowing that any delays or course deviations could leave her without enough power to return safely. As she worked, other members of her crew began arriving for the morning shift. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, her crew chief, noticed the unusual activity around her aircraft and approached with obvious concern. "Major, what's going on? I thought all flights were grounded until further notice." Sarah looked up from her instrument panel, knowing that her next words would put Rodriguez in an impossible position. "Mike, I need you to help me save those SEALs. The storm is going to kill them if we don't act soon." Rodriguez glanced around the hangar, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Ma'am, you know the colonel's orders. Nobody flies until this weather clears. Those men don't have time to wait for the weather to clear. By the time this storm passes, they'll be dead from exposure and hypothermia. What about the rest of the crew? You can't fly a rescue mission by yourself." Sarah had already considered this problem. A standard rescue operation would require a full crew of 4 people: pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and medic. But taking additional personnel would mean involving more people in her decision to disobey orders, and it would also add weight to the aircraft that might be critical for performance in the severe weather conditions. "I'm going alone," she said firmly. "This way, if something goes wrong, only my career is at risk." Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting years of military experience and the difficult choices that came with serving in combat zones. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Ma'am, if you're determined to do this, at least let me help you prep the bird properly. Those SEALs are going to need every advantage we can give them." Together, they completed the final preparations for what everyone knew would be an extremely dangerous mission. Rodriguez helped Sarah load additional survival equipment and medical supplies, while also ensuring that the aircraft's heating systems were functioning at maximum efficiency. The rescued SEALs would be suffering from severe cold exposure, and keeping them warm during the flight back to base would be crucial for their survival. As morning progressed into early afternoon, Sarah monitored weather reports and radio communications from the trapped team. The SEALs were still alive, but their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Lieutenant Commander Morrison reported that several team members were showing signs of severe hypothermia, and their defensive ammunition was running dangerously low. More concerning were reports of increased Taliban activity in the area. Enemy fighters had apparently decided to wait out the storm and then assault the SEAL position once weather conditions improved. If Sarah delayed her rescue attempt much longer, the team might find themselves under attack from a force they could not hope to defeat in their weakened condition. At 1:30 p.m., weather monitoring stations reported a temporary decrease in wind speed and a slight improvement in visibility. Sarah knew this might be her only opportunity. She completed her final equipment checks and prepared to start the engines, knowing that once she began this mission, there would be no turning back. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached her aircraft one final time, carrying a thermos of hot coffee and a grim expression. "Major, I want you to know that what you're doing takes more courage than anything I've seen in 20 years of service. Those boys are lucky to have someone willing to risk everything to bring them home." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, knowing she would need the warmth during the long flight through freezing conditions. "Mike, if this goes badly, I want you to know that the decision was entirely mine. You followed orders and tried to stop me." "Understood, ma'am. But, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. No soldier should die alone on Christmas Eve, especially not when we have the ability to help them." As Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began the engine startup sequence, she thought about the 12 men waiting on the mountain. They had volunteered for dangerous duty, knowing that they might be asked to make the ultimate sacrifice for their country. But they had also trusted that their fellow service members would never abandon them when rescue was possible. The Black Hawk's twin-turbine engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the aircraft frame as Sarah completed her pre-flight checklist one final time. Outside, snow continued to fall heavily, and wind gusts rocked the helicopter even while it remained on the ground. Sarah contacted the control tower, knowing that her next transmission would likely end her military career, but might save 12 lives. "Tower, this is Rescue 7 requesting immediate clearance for emergency medical evacuation to grid coordinates November 774, Echo 229. The response came immediately, with obvious surprise in the air traffic controller's voice. "Rescue 7, negative on departure clearance. All aircraft are grounded by order of base commander. Return to parking position immediately. Tower, I have 12 American soldiers dying on a mountain. I am declaring a flight emergency and departing under emergency authority provisions." Sarah knew that military regulations did provide for emergency departures when lives were in immediate danger, but she also knew that using this authority against direct orders from her commanding officer would result in serious consequences. However, she was beyond caring about regulations and career implications. As she lifted the helicopter into the swirling snow and darkness, Sarah Chun became the only pilot willing to fly into the worst storm in decades to save 12 Navy SEALs who had been abandoned by everyone else. She had 90 seconds to prove that courage and skill could overcome impossible odds, and that no American soldier would die alone on Christmas Eve while she had the power to prevent it. The mountain peaks ahead disappeared into the storm clouds, and Sarah flew toward them with grim determination, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether 12 heroes would see another Christmas morning. The Black Hawk helicopter climbed steadily through the blizzard as Sarah fought to maintain control in winds that seemed determined to tear her aircraft apart. Ice formed instantly on the windscreen, forcing her to rely entirely on instruments while flying through mountain passes where a single navigation error could mean death. The radio crackled with angry transmissions from the control tower, ordering her immediate return, but Sarah had already switched to the emergency frequency used by the trapped SEALs. Alpha Team, this is Rescue 7 inbound to your position. Do you copy?" Static filled her headphones for several long seconds before a weak voice responded through the interference. "Rescue 7, this is Alpha Team Leader. We copy your transmission, but show negative on any authorized aircraft in our area. Please confirm your identity and mission authorization." "Alpha Team, this is Major Sarah Chun, pilot of Rescue 7. I am conducting emergency medical evacuation without command authorization. What is your current status and condition of casualties?" Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison's voice came back stronger, with obvious relief mixed with professional concern. Rescue 7. We have 3 serious casualties requiring immediate medical attention. Team is consolidated in defensive position at elevation 8,400 feet. Be advised, enemy forces are moving to assault positions approximately 1 kilometer below our location. Sarah checked her navigation display and calculated that she was still 20 minutes away from the SEAL position. The weather continued to worsen, with wind gusts now exceeding 80 miles per hour and visibility dropping to near zero. Flying through these conditions required constant course corrections to compensate for wind drift, and the mountainous terrain left no room for navigation errors. More troubling was Morrison's report about enemy forces. The Taliban fighters had apparently decided to attack despite the storm, probably realizing that American air support would be grounded by the weather. If they reached the SEAL position before Sarah could extract the team, the rescue mission would become a recovery operation. Alpha Team, understood on enemy situation. I am approximately 20 minutes from your position. Can you hold until I arrive? Rescue 7. We are low on ammunition and have limited defensive capabilities due to casualties. We will hold as long as possible, but enemy appears to be in significant strength. Sarah increased power to her engines, pushing the aircraft to maximum performance despite the dangerous conditions. The Black Hawk shuddered as it fought through severe turbulence, with ice forming on the rotor blades that could cause catastrophic failure if allowed to accumulate. She activated the aircraft's de-icing systems, knowing that they would drain precious electrical power, but having no choice if she wanted to maintain flight capability. The terrain below was invisible in the blowing snow, but Sarah knew from her map study that she was flying through some of the most dangerous mountain passes in Afghanistan. Peaks rose to over 10,000 feet on both sides of her flight path, with narrow valleys that could become death traps if she lost navigation reference. The GPS system provided basic position information, but terrain warnings flashed constantly as the aircraft flew near minimum safe altitudes. As Sarah struggled to maintain course, her radio suddenly burst with the sound of heavy gunfire and explosions. Rescue 7, we are under attack. Enemy forces have reached our position and are attempting to overrun our defensive line. We need immediate extraction or we will be overwhelmed. Sarah could hear automatic weapons fire in the background of Morrison's transmission, along with the distinctive sound of rocket-propelled grenades exploding against rock surfaces. The SEALs were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, and she was still 15 minutes away. Alpha Team, hold your position. I am inbound hot, and will be at your location as soon as possible. Mark your position with infrared strobes, if available. Negative on strobes, Rescue 7. All signaling devices were lost during previous contact. We will mark position with flashlight signals when you are overhead. Sarah realized that finding the SEAL position in zero visibility would be almost impossible without proper marking devices. She would have to rely on GPS coordinates and hope that the team could provide visual reference when she arrived at their general location. Landing on an unknown mountain peak in a blizzard while under enemy fire would test every skill she possessed as a pilot. The sounds of battle continued over the radio as Morrison provided tactical updates between bursts of gunfire. The Taliban assault was coming from 2 directions, with enemy fighters advancing up the mountain slopes, while others attempted to flank the SEAL position from higher ground. The Americans had established defensive positions among rock formations near the cave system, but their ammunition was running critically low. Rescue 7. Be advised we have approximately 10 minutes of defensive ammunition remaining. After that, we will be combat ineffective. Sarah checked her navigation display and saw that she was still 8 minutes from the target area. Even if everything went perfectly, she would arrive just as the SEALs ran out of ammunition to defend themselves. The timing would be desperate, with no margin for error or delays. She pushed the aircraft even harder, accepting higher levels of risk as she flew through mountain passes at speeds that left no room for recovery if something went wrong. The engine screamed under maximum power settings, and warning lights flashed on her instrument panel as various systems approached their operational limits. As Sarah flew toward the sounds of battle, she thought about the impossibility of what she was attempting. Landing a helicopter in a blizzard was dangerous enough under normal circumstances. Doing it on an unimproved mountain peak while under enemy fire bordered on suicide. But 12 American soldiers were fighting for their lives, and she was their only hope for survival. The radio crackled again with Morrison's voice, now strained with the effort of coordinating his team's defense while providing information to his rescuer. Rescue 7. Enemy forces are approximately 50 meters from our position. We are taking heavy casualties and cannot maintain defensive fire much longer. What is your ETA? Alpha Team, I am 5 minutes out. Prepare for immediate extraction under fire. Have your casualties ready to move on my signal. Sarah began her approach descent, relying entirely on instruments as she flew toward GPS coordinates that represented 12 men fighting for their lives. The terrain warnings became more insistent as she descended toward the mountain peak, with the aircraft's collision avoidance system providing constant alerts about rising ground and obstacles. At 3,000 feet above the target elevation, Sarah broke through the bottom of the cloud layer and, suddenly, found herself in a world of swirling snow and rock faces that appeared and disappeared in the blowing wind. Visibility improved slightly, but she could see no more than a few hundred meters in any direction. The GPS indicated that she was directly over the SEAL position, but Sarah could see no sign of the team or their defensive positions. The mountain peak below appeared to be nothing but snow-covered rocks and ice, with no obvious landing areas or evidence of human presence. Alpha Team, this is Rescue 7 overhead your position. I cannot see your location. Need immediate visual reference. Suddenly, a small light appeared among the rocks below, flashing in a pattern that Sarah recognized as military signaling code. The light disappeared and reappeared several times as Morrison tried to mark his position despite the risk of drawing enemy fire. Rescue 7, did you see our signal? We are in the rocks approximately 100 meters north of the light source. Sarah turned her aircraft toward the signal and began looking for a suitable landing area. The mountain peak was covered with large boulders and ice formations that would make landing extremely difficult. She needed a flat area at least 60 feet long and 30 feet wide to safely set down her helicopter, but the terrain below offered no such location. As she circled the area, looking desperately for a landing zone, the sound of gunfire intensified over the radio. The Taliban forces had apparently spotted her aircraft and were increasing their assault in an attempt to overrun the SEAL position before extraction could be completed. Rescue 7. We are almost out of ammunition. You need to get us out now. Sarah made a decision that went against every safety regulation she had ever learned. Instead of landing in a secure area and allowing the SEALs to reach her aircraft, she would hover just above the ground and pull the team up using the helicopter's rescue hoist. This technique was normally used only over water or other safe areas, but it might be possible to extract the wounded men from their defensive positions. Alpha Team, I cannot find a safe landing zone. Prepare for hoist extraction. Move casualties to the highest accessible point near your position. Sarah positioned her aircraft directly above the area where she had seen the signal light, fighting to maintain stable hover in winds that buffeted the helicopter from all directions. Flying this close to the ground in zero visibility required absolute precision, with terrain rising on all sides that could destroy her aircraft with a single control error. She activated the rescue hoist and began lowering the penetrator device that the SEALs could use to attach themselves for extraction. The cable descended into the swirling snow, disappearing from view as it reached toward the trapped team below. Alpha Team, rescue device is coming down. Attach your most seriously wounded first, and signal when ready for extraction. The radio exploded with the sound of close combat as Taliban fighters launched their final assault on the SEAL position. Sarah could hear grenades exploding and automatic weapons firing at point-blank range as the Americans fought desperately to hold their defensive line long enough for extraction to be completed. Rescue 7. Enemy is in our position. We are engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Extract immediately. Sarah felt the rescue cable jerk as someone below attached themselves to the penetrator. Without waiting for confirmation, she began raising the hoist, pulling the first casualty up through the blowing snow toward her aircraft. Every second of delay increased the chance that the Taliban would overrun the remaining SEALs or that ground fire would bring down her helicopter. Through her side window, she could see muzzle flashes among the rocks below as the battle raged around the extraction point. Tracers flew past her aircraft, and she heard the distinctive crack of bullets striking her fuselage. The Taliban had realized what was happening and were trying to shoot down her helicopter before the rescue could be completed. The first SEAL reached her cabin door, and Sarah could see that he was unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. She quickly pulled him inside and immediately began lowering the hoist again for the next extraction. Alpha Team, first casualty is aboard. Send the next man immediately. Rescue 7. We've got 2 more critical wounded coming up. Enemy forces are in our defensive line. We may not be able to hold much longer. Sarah maintained her hover despite increasing ground fire and deteriorating weather conditions. Ice continued to form on her aircraft, and the engines were operating beyond recommended limits. Warning lights flashed continuously, indicating system failures that could become catastrophic at any moment. The second casualty arrived at her door, another unconscious SEAL with severe injuries that would require immediate medical attention. Sarah pulled him inside and prepared for the third extraction, knowing that she was running out of time and aircraft performance capability. Alpha Team, how many more casualties for immediate extraction? Rescue 7. 1 more critical. Then, we can move the walking wounded. But enemy forces are overrunning our position. We need to move fast. As Sarah lowered the hoist for the 3rd time, her aircraft was suddenly rocked by an explosion that shattered her side window and filled the cabin with smoke and debris. A rocket-propelled grenade had detonated just meters away, sending shrapnel through her fuselage and damaging critical flight systems. Warning alarms sounded as hydraulic pressure dropped and electrical systems began failing. The aircraft started to lose altitude as damaged components struggled to maintain flight capability. Sarah realized that her helicopter was critically damaged and might not be able to remain airborne much longer. Alpha Team, my aircraft is hit and losing systems. I can take 1 more man. Then, I have to depart immediately or we'll all die on this mountain. The 3rd casualty reached her door, but Sarah could see through her damaged window that enemy fighters were now among the rocks where the remaining SEALs were making their final stand. Muzzle flashes indicated fierce fighting at point-blank range as the Americans used their last ammunition to hold off the assault. Sarah knew she was facing an impossible choice. Her aircraft was badly damaged and losing altitude, with warning systems indicating imminent catastrophic failure. She could save the 3 casualties already aboard and escape before her helicopter crashed, or she could attempt to rescue the remaining 9 SEALs and risk killing everyone when her aircraft inevitably went down. As she struggled with this decision, Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice came over the radio one final time, calm and professional despite the desperate situation. Rescue 7. Get those casualties to medical care. We will hold this position and wait for the next extraction opportunity. Both Morrison and Sarah knew there would be no next opportunity. The storm was worsening. Her helicopter was the only aircraft capable of reaching the mountain, and it was now too damaged to fly another mission. But Morrison was asking her to save the lives she could rather than risk losing everyone in a futile attempt at complete rescue. Sarah made the hardest decision of her military career, pulling up on the collective and beginning to climb away from the mountain peak as the sounds of the final battle faded behind her. Sarah's damaged helicopter struggled through the blizzard as she fought to keep the aircraft airborne with failing systems, and 3 critically wounded SEALs bleeding out in her cabin. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across her windscreen from damaged lines, and warning lights flashed red across her instrument panel. The explosion from the rocket-propelled grenade had torn through vital components, and she knew she was flying a machine that could fail catastrophically at any moment. The 3 rescued SEALs lay unconscious on the cabin floor, their uniforms soaked with blood from gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries. Without proper medical equipment or trained personnel aboard, Sarah could do nothing to treat their injuries except maintain cabin heating and get them to a hospital as quickly as possible. Every minute of delay meant a greater chance that these men would die from blood loss or shock. But Sarah's mind was not focused on the casualties in her cabin. She was thinking about the 9 SEALs she had left behind on the mountain, men who were now facing certain death at the hands of Taliban fighters. The sounds of that final battle still echoed in her headphones, and she knew that Morrison and his remaining team members were either dead or captured by now. The flight back to base should have taken 40 minutes under normal conditions, but Sarah's damaged aircraft could barely maintain altitude and was losing power steadily. She had to reduce speed and climb gradually to avoid stressing the failing systems, which meant the wounded men would have to endure a longer flight without medical attention. As she flew through the storm, Sarah's radio crackled with transmissions from the base control tower. Word of her unauthorized rescue mission had apparently reached Colonel Webb, and the communications were becoming increasingly urgent. Rescue 7, this is base control. You are ordered to provide immediate position report and estimated time of arrival. Medical teams are standing by for casualty reception. Sarah keyed her microphone, knowing that she would face serious consequences for her actions, but no longer caring about her career prospects. Base control, this is Rescue 7 inbound with 3 critical casualties. ETA approximately 30 minutes. Request emergency medical response on landing. Rescue 7, be advised that Colonel Webb requires immediate debriefing upon your arrival. You are restricted to base pending investigation of unauthorized flight operations. Understood, base control. My priority is getting these casualties to medical care. Everything else can wait. Sarah's aircraft shuddered as another system failed, and she felt the controls become increasingly sluggish. The damaged hydraulic lines were losing pressure rapidly, making the helicopter harder to control with each passing minute. She began preparing for an emergency landing procedure, knowing that she might not be able to reach the base before the aircraft became unflyable. 20 minutes into the return flight, her worst fears were realized when the hydraulic failure warning light illuminated, indicating complete loss of the primary flight control system. The Black Hawk immediately became much more difficult to control, requiring constant inputs from Sarah to maintain stable flight. She declared an in-flight emergency and requested priority landing clearance, knowing that she had perhaps 10 minutes before the aircraft would be impossible to control. The base scrambled emergency response teams and cleared all other traffic from the airspace, preparing for what might become a crash landing. Rescue 7, emergency vehicles are in position. Runway is clear for your approach. Be advised that weather conditions at base are deteriorating with visibility dropping to 1/4 mile. Sarah could see the base lights through the blowing snow as she began her final approach, but the aircraft was responding poorly to control inputs and losing altitude faster than she intended. The 3 wounded SEALs were still unconscious, which was probably a blessing considering the violent motion of the failing helicopter. As she crossed the runway threshold, Sarah realized that her aircraft was descending too quickly and might impact the ground with fatal force. She pulled back on the controls, trying to arrest the descent, but the damaged hydraulic system could not provide enough response to save the landing. The Black Hawk struck the runway hard, bouncing twice before sliding sideways in the snow and coming to a stop just short of the taxiway. Emergency vehicles raced toward the aircraft as Sarah shut down the engines and prepared to evacuate her casualties. Medical teams reached the helicopter within seconds, pulling the 3 wounded SEALs from the cabin and loading them onto stretchers for immediate transport to the base hospital. Sarah climbed out of her cockpit on unsteady legs, exhausted from the physical and emotional stress of the flight, but alive and successful in saving at least 3 lives. Colonel Webb arrived at the crash site within minutes, his expression grim as he surveyed the damaged aircraft and the activity around the medical evacuation. Sarah stood beside her helicopter, still wearing her flight gear and covered with blood from the casualties she had rescued. Major Chun, you are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, unauthorized use of military aircraft, and endangering personnel. You will surrender your flight credentials and report to my office for immediate disciplinary action. Sarah removed her helmet and looked directly at her commanding officer, feeling no regret for her actions despite the consequences she would face. Yes, sir. But I want to know about the 9 men I left on that mountain. Are we sending another rescue mission? Colonel Webb's expression softened slightly, and Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes between military discipline and concern for the soldiers still trapped on the mountain. Major, the weather conditions make another rescue mission impossible. We cannot risk more lives attempting a mission that has virtually no chance of success. Sir, those men are still alive. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's team can hold out if we get supplies to them. Even if we cannot extract them immediately, we can drop medical supplies and ammunition to help them survive until the weather improves. The decision has been made, Major. No further rescue operations will be authorized until weather conditions permit safe flight operations. Sarah felt anger and frustration building inside her as she realized that the military bureaucracy was going to abandon 9 American soldiers rather than risk another unauthorized mission. The same caution that had nearly let 12 men die was now condemning the survivors to death on the mountain. Sir, I request permission to volunteer for another rescue mission. My aircraft is damaged, but there are other helicopters available. I can guide another pilot to the location and help coordinate extraction. Absolutely not, Major. You have already demonstrated poor judgment and a willingness to disregard orders. You will not be involved in any future operations related to this situation. As Colonel Webb walked away to coordinate with the medical teams, Sarah made a decision that would either save 9 lives or end her military career permanently. She was not going to abandon Morrison and his team, even if it meant facing court-martial and imprisonment for her actions. The base had several other helicopters available, including aircraft that were newer and better equipped than her damaged Black Hawk. If she could convince another pilot to attempt a second rescue mission, they might be able to reach the trapped SEALs before the Taliban consolidated their control of the mountain peak. Sarah spent the next several hours in debriefing sessions with intelligence officers and military investigators, providing detailed information about the rescue mission and the current situation of the remaining team members. She also used this time to study weather reports and develop a plan for a second extraction attempt. The storm was beginning to weaken slightly, with wind speeds dropping to manageable levels for short periods. If a pilot could time their approach correctly, they might be able to reach the mountain during one of these brief weather windows. More importantly, Sarah had observed details about the terrain and enemy positions during her first mission that would be crucial for a successful second attempt. She knew the exact location of the SEAL defensive positions and had seen the Taliban assault routes. This information could mean the difference between success and failure for another rescue pilot. Late that evening, as snow continued to fall outside the base operations center, Sarah approached Captain Michael Torres, one of the most experienced pilots in the squadron. Torres had flown numerous dangerous missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and she believed he might be willing to attempt another rescue operation. Mike, I need to talk to you about something that could get us both in serious trouble. Captain Torres looked up from the flight manual he was studying, immediately recognizing the serious tone in Sarah's voice. What's on your mind, Major? 9 SEALs are still alive on that mountain, and nobody is going to help them because the mission is too dangerous. I think there's a window tomorrow morning when the weather might be manageable for another extraction attempt. Torres closed his manual and leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face carefully. Sarah, you just crash-landed a shot-up helicopter and got yourself arrested for disobeying orders. Are you seriously asking me to volunteer for another unauthorized mission? Mike, those men saved my life during my first deployment. Lieutenant Commander Morrison pulled me out of a crashed aircraft under fire 3 years ago in Iraq. I cannot abandon him when he needs help. Even if I wanted to help, which I'm not saying I do, how would we get authorization? Colonel Webb has made it clear that no more rescue missions will be approved. Sarah pulled out a folder containing weather reports and tactical information she had gathered during her debriefings. We don't need authorization if we can justify the mission as an emergency response to new intelligence. I have detailed information about enemy positions and SEAL locations that wasn't available before. We could argue that this intelligence changes the tactical situation enough to warrant immediate action. Torres studied the documents Sarah had provided, noting the precise coordinates and terrain features that would be essential for a successful rescue mission. This is good intelligence, but it doesn't change the fundamental problem. The weather is still too dangerous for safe flight operations. The weather is improving, Mike. Look at these projections for tomorrow morning. There's a 4-hour window when visibility should improve to minimally acceptable levels. If we time our departure correctly, we can reach the mountain and complete extraction before conditions deteriorate again. Captain Torres was quiet for several minutes as he considered Sarah's proposal. He had served with several of the trapped seals during previous deployments and knew them to be exceptional soldiers who deserved every effort to bring them home safely. But he also understood the risks involved in another rescue mission and the consequences they would face if something went wrong. Sarah, if we do this and it goes badly, we'll both be facing court-martial and possibly prison time. Are you prepared for that? Mike, if we don't do this, 9 good men are going to die on Christmas Day while we sit safely on base following orders. I've already crossed the line by conducting one unauthorized mission. I'm prepared to cross it again if it means bringing our people home. Torres nodded slowly, recognizing the determination in Sarah's voice and the moral arguments that made abandoning the rescue unacceptable. All right, Major. If you're willing to guide me to that mountain and help coordinate the extraction, I'll fly the mission. But we do this smart and we do this safe. I don't want to create more casualties while trying to prevent them. Sarah felt relief flood through her as she realized that the trapped seals would have another chance for survival. Thank you, Mike. I'll provide navigation support and tactical coordination. Together, we can bring those men home. As they began planning the unauthorized rescue mission that would take place in less than 12 hours, both pilots understood that they were risking everything to save 9 soldiers who had been abandoned by everyone else. But they also knew that the military values of never leaving anyone behind meant more than following orders that condemned good men to death. Christmas Day would bring either redemption or disaster, but at least Morrison and his team would know that their fellow service members had not given up the fight to bring them home. Christmas morning arrived with the worst blizzard conditions anyone at the base had ever experienced, but Sarah Chun and Captain Mike Torres were already preparing for their unauthorized rescue mission in the pre-dawn darkness. The weather forecast showed a brief window of improved visibility between 8 o'clock and 10 a.m., when wind speeds might drop enough to allow helicopter operations in the mountains. Sarah had spent the night studying detailed topographical maps and satellite imagery, planning multiple approach routes to the SEAL position that would minimize exposure to enemy fire and dangerous terrain. She had also monitored Taliban radio frequencies, gathering intelligence about enemy movements and intentions that would be crucial for mission success. The intercepted communications revealed disturbing information about the situation on the mountain. Taliban forces had apparently captured the SEAL defensive positions during the previous evening's assault, but they had not found the Americans themselves. Morrison and his 8 surviving team members had withdrawn to a secondary position in the cave system, where they were trapped but still alive. More concerning were enemy plans to execute any captured Americans at sunrise on Christmas Day as a symbolic victory against coalition forces. This meant that Sarah and Torres had less than 4 hours to reach the mountain and extract the team before the deadline expired. Captain Torres had selected his newest Black Hawk helicopter for the mission, an aircraft equipped with advanced navigation systems and enhanced defensive capabilities that would be essential for survival in hostile territory. The helicopter also carried additional fuel capacity that would allow for extended operations without requiring refueling at the base. As they conducted pre-flight preparations in the darkness, both pilots understood that this mission carried even greater risks than Sarah's previous rescue attempt. The Taliban forces on the mountain were now alerted to American rescue efforts and would be prepared for another helicopter assault. The weather conditions, while improved from the previous day, were still extremely dangerous for mountain flying. Sarah, I want you to understand that if we get into serious trouble up there, I may have to make some hard choices about who we can save, Torres said as he checked his aircraft systems. I won't sacrifice both our lives trying to rescue people who are already beyond help. I understand, Mike. But I also know that Morrison and his team are some of the toughest operators in the military. If they're still alive, they're still fighting, and they deserve our best effort to bring them home. As the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, Sarah received an encrypted radio message that changed everything about their mission planning. The message came from Lieutenant Commander Morrison himself, transmitted on an emergency frequency that indicated desperate circumstances. Any coalition forces monitoring this frequency. This is Alpha Team Leader. We are alive, but trapped in cave system approximately 200 meters north of previous position. Enemy forces control our original defensive area. We have visual on enemy execution preparations. Request immediate extraction before 0800 hours local time, or we will be overrun. Sarah immediately responded to Morrison's transmission, knowing that her reply would reveal their rescue plans to anyone monitoring the radio frequency. Alpha Team, this is Major Chun with rescue aircraft inbound to your position. ETA 40 minutes. Move to extraction point when you hear our aircraft approaching. Major Chun, be advised that enemy has prepared anti-aircraft positions around our location. They are expecting another rescue attempt and have positioned RPGs and heavy machine guns to engage helicopters. Your approach will be under intense fire. This intelligence confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the tactical situation. The Taliban had learned from the previous night's events and were now ready for another American rescue attempt. Flying into their prepared defensive positions would be extremely dangerous, with a high probability of aircraft destruction and crew casualties. Torres listened to the radio exchange with growing concern, realizing that they were flying into what amounted to an anti-aircraft trap. Sarah, if they have prepared positions with RPGs, we might not be able to get close enough for extraction. One lucky shot will bring us down. Mike, those men are going to be executed if we don't try. Maybe we can use the terrain to mask our approach and avoid some of their defensive fire. Sarah studied her maps again, looking for alternative routes that might allow them to reach the SEAL position without flying directly through the Taliban defensive zone. The mountain terrain was complex, with multiple ridges and valleys that could provide concealment for a helicopter approach. She identified a possible route that would take them around the eastern side of the mountain, using a narrow valley to approach the cave system from an unexpected direction. This route would be extremely dangerous, requiring precise navigation through terrain that left no margin for error, but it might allow them to avoid the worst of the enemy anti-aircraft fire. Mike, look at this approach route. If we can stay low in this valley and use the ridge line for cover, we might be able to reach the cave entrance without being detected until the last moment. Torres studied Sarah's proposed route, noting the narrow passages and sharp turns that would be required. This is going to be like threading a needle while flying through a hurricane. One navigation error, and we'll fly into a mountain face. I can guide you through it. I've flown similar terrain in Alaska, and I know how to read the wind patterns in these valleys. We can do this if we time everything perfectly. As they completed their final preparations, both pilots received word that Colonel Webb had been informed of their unauthorized mission and was ordering immediate cancellation of all flight operations. Security forces were being dispatched to prevent any aircraft from departing the base without proper authorization. Major Chun and Captain Torres, you are ordered to cease all flight preparations and report to base operations immediately. Any attempt to depart will result in arrest and court-martial proceedings. Sarah and Torres looked at each other, realizing that they had perhaps minutes before security forces arrived to stop their mission. If they were going to save Morrison and his team, they had to leave immediately. Mike, it's now or never. Are you ready to do this? Let's bring our people home. Torres started the engines while Sarah completed the final navigation setup, programming their GPS systems with waypoints for the complex mountain approach. Outside, they could see security vehicles racing across the airfield toward their position, but the helicopter was already beginning to lift off. Base control, this is Rescue 8 declaring emergency authority and departing for medical evacuation mission. Do not attempt to interfere with this flight. The helicopter climbed quickly into the gray morning sky, disappearing into the low clouds before ground security could take action to prevent their departure. Sarah knew that this time there would be no forgiveness for disobeying orders, but 9 American soldiers were facing execution, and that was the only consideration that mattered. As they flew toward the mountains, Sarah monitored Taliban radio frequencies and provided Torres with constant updates about wind conditions and terrain features. The weather was indeed improving slightly, with visibility increasing to nearly 2 miles and wind speeds dropping to manageable levels. The flight to the mountain took 35 minutes, with Torres demonstrating exceptional flying skills as he navigated through the complex terrain using Sarah's guidance. They approached from the east as planned, staying low in the valley and using the ridge lines to mask their presence from enemy observers. 5 miles from the target area, Sarah established radio contact with Morrison's team to coordinate the final approach and extraction procedures. Alpha Team, this is Rescue 8 approaching from the east. What is your current situation and readiness for immediate extraction? Rescue 8, we have eyes on enemy execution preparations. They are setting up for prisoner execution at 0800 hours. All team members are mobile and ready for extraction, but we will be under heavy fire during movement to pick up point. Sarah checked her watch and realized they had less than 20 minutes before the Taliban deadline. Everything would have to work perfectly if they were going to save the team in time. Alpha Team, we are beginning our final approach. Move to extraction point when you hear our aircraft overhead. Be prepared for immediate departure under fire. Torres guided the helicopter through the final valley approach, flying at maximum speed while staying below the ridge line to avoid detection. Sarah could see the mountain peak ahead where Morrison's team was trapped, along with smoke rising from Taliban positions that indicated the enemy was indeed preparing for something significant. As they rounded the final ridge and the cave system came into view, Sarah could see that the tactical situation was even worse than they had anticipated. Taliban fighters had established positions completely around the cave entrance, with heavy weapons pointed at every possible escape route. The SEALs were trapped in a killing zone that would make extraction extremely difficult. Mike, this is going to be the hardest landing of your life. Enemy positions are everywhere, and we'll be taking fire from the moment we appear over that ridge. Understood. Just get me to a spot where we can pick up those men, and I'll handle the flying. As Torres prepared for the final approach to the extraction point, both pilots knew they were flying into the most dangerous situation either had ever faced. But somewhere in those caves, 9 American soldiers were counting on them to arrive before their enemies could carry out a Christmas Day execution that would end their lives far from home. The next few minutes would determine whether courage and skill could overcome impossible odds, or whether this rescue mission would become a tragedy that claimed even more American lives on what should have been a day of peace and celebration. The Black Hawk helicopter burst over the ridge line at exactly 7:47 a.m. on Christmas Day, appearing suddenly above the Taliban positions like an avenging angel emerging from the storm clouds. Captain Torres dove the aircraft toward the mountain peak at maximum speed, while Sarah coordinated with Morrison's team over the radio, knowing they had less than 13 minutes to complete the extraction before the enemy deadline expired. Alpha Team, Rescue 8 is overhead. Move to extraction point immediately. The response from Lieutenant Commander Morrison was immediate but strained. Moving now. Be advised, enemy is in prepared positions all around our route. You will take heavy fire. As Morrison's words echoed through the radio, the Taliban positions erupted with muzzle flashes as dozens of fighters opened fire on the helicopter with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Torres threw the aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers, diving and climbing unpredictably to avoid the incoming fire while searching for a landing zone near the cave entrance. Sarah could see the 9 SEALs emerging from the cave system, moving in tactical formation despite their obvious exhaustion and injuries. Morrison led from the front, carrying 1 wounded team member while the others provided covering fire against the Taliban positions surrounding their escape route. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded just meters from the helicopter, sending shrapnel through the fuselage and shattering the side windows. Torres fought to maintain control as warning lights flashed across his instrument panel, indicating damage to critical flight systems. Sarah, I can't find a safe landing zone. The terrain is too rough, and there's too much enemy fire. We're going to have to use the hoist again. Sarah activated the rescue hoist system while Torres established a hover directly over the SEAL team, despite the intense ground fire that was now focused entirely on their aircraft. Bullets struck the helicopter constantly, with the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds penetrating the fuselage and cabin area. Alpha Team, rescue hoist is coming down. Attach wounded personnel first, and Signal when ready. Below, Morrison's team had reached a small clearing near the cave entrance, but they were completely exposed to enemy fire from 3 directions. The SEALs formed a defensive perimeter around their wounded teammates while Morrison attached the first casualty to the rescue device. As Sarah began raising the hoist with the first wounded SEAL, a Taliban fighter with an RPG launcher appeared on a ridge directly above the helicopter. Torres saw the threat and immediately rolled the aircraft hard to the left, causing the rescue cable to swing wildly as the grenade exploded where they had been hovering seconds earlier. Sarah, we've got RPGs from high ground. I can't maintain stable hover in this position. The first casualty reached the helicopter cabin, unconscious but alive, as Sarah immediately began lowering the hoist again for the second extraction. Below, the remaining SEALs were running low on ammunition and taking casualties as Taliban fighters closed in from all directions. Rescue 8, we've got 2 more critical wounded coming up, but enemy is almost in our position. You need to get us out now. The second wounded SEAL reached the helicopter just as another RPG exploded nearby, this time close enough to rock the aircraft violently and knock out several electrical systems. Torres realized that his helicopter was taking catastrophic damage and would not be able to remain airborne much longer. Sarah, we're losing too many systems. I can take maybe 2 more men. Then, we have to get out of here or we're all going down. Sarah looked down at the 7 SEALs still on the ground, knowing that Torres was right about their aircraft's condition, but unable to accept that they would have to abandon men again. She could see Morrison directing his team's final defensive efforts while enemy fighters advanced to within 50 meters of their position. Alpha Team, my aircraft is critically damaged. Send your next 2 men immediately. Then, we'll have to come back for the rest. Morrison's voice came back immediately, with the calm professionalism that had made him one of the Navy's most respected operators. Negative, Rescue 8. All my men go together, or none of us go. Find a way to get everyone. Sarah realized that Morrison was willing to sacrifice his own life and the lives of his entire team rather than leave anyone behind. This was the SEAL ethos in action, the absolute commitment to never abandon a teammate regardless of the circumstances. Torres heard Morrison's transmission and understood the impossible situation they were facing. His aircraft was failing rapidly, with hydraulic systems damaged and engines running beyond safe operating limits. But 9 American soldiers were refusing to abandon each other, and that level of courage demanded an equally heroic response. Sarah, there's one option that might work, but it's going to be incredibly dangerous. If I can land this bird on that flat area near the cave, we might be able to get everyone aboard before the aircraft becomes unflyable. Sarah looked at the small area Torres had identified, realizing it was barely large enough for a helicopter landing and completely exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. Landing there would mean sitting stationary under intense fire while loading 9 men, any one of whom might be too wounded to move quickly. Mike, that's a suicide landing. We'll be sitting ducks while they load, and the aircraft might not be able to lift off again with all that weight and damage. Those men aren't leaving anyone behind, and neither am I. We're going to get all 9 of them, or we're all going to die trying. Torres began his approach to the improvised landing zone, while Sarah coordinated with Morrison's team for immediate boarding once they touched down. The Taliban forces realized what the Americans were attempting and concentrated all their fire on the landing area, creating a deadly crossfire that would catch the helicopter the moment it touched ground. Alpha Team, we are landing in 30 seconds. Be ready to board immediately. Wounded men first, then everyone else as fast as possible. The helicopter descended through a storm of gunfire as Torres fought to maintain control with failing systems and battle damage that grew worse each second. Sarah could see individual Taliban fighters clearly now, close enough to observe their faces as they aimed automatic weapons directly at the aircraft. Torres flared the helicopter at the last moment, cushioning the landing despite the rough terrain and damaged flight controls. The instant the wheels touched ground, Morrison's team began moving toward the aircraft while maintaining suppressive fire against the surrounding enemy positions. The first 4 SEALs reached the helicopter and dove through the open doors, with Sarah helping to pull the wounded men inside, while Torres kept the engines running at full power. Enemy fire intensified as Taliban fighters realized this was their last chance to prevent the American escape. A heavy machine gun opened fire from less than 100 meters away, sending a stream of bullets through the helicopter cabin and striking one of the rescued SEALs in the chest. Sarah applied pressure to the wound while continuing to coordinate the evacuation of the remaining team members. 5 more men coming in. Keep those engines running. Morrison and the last 4 SEALs sprinted toward the helicopter as enemy fighters launched a final assault on their position. Grenades exploded around the landing zone as the Americans dove into the aircraft cabin, with Morrison pulling himself through the door just as Torres began lifting off. The overloaded helicopter struggled to gain altitude as Torres demanded maximum performance from engines that were already operating beyond their limits. Warning alarms sounded throughout the cabin as multiple systems failed, but the aircraft slowly climbed away from the mountain peak that had been the SEALs' prison for 3 days. Everyone's aboard. Let's get out of here. But as they cleared the ridgeline, Torres realized that his aircraft was not going to make it back to base. The damage from enemy fire and the stress of maximum performance operations had pushed the helicopter beyond its capability to sustain flight. They were going to crash, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. "Sarah, we're going down. Find me somewhere to put this bird down before we fall out of the sky." Sarah scanned the terrain below, looking desperately for a flat area where Torres could attempt an emergency landing. The mountains offered few options, but she spotted a small valley about 5 miles from their current position that might provide enough space for a controlled crash. "Mike, head for that valley at 2 o'clock. It's our best option for getting down in one piece." Torres turned toward the valley as his aircraft continued to lose altitude and power. Behind them, the rescued SEALs worked to treat their wounded teammates while preparing for what would likely be a hard landing in hostile territory. As the helicopter descended toward what might be their final landing, Sarah thought about the incredible chain of events that had brought them to this moment. 12 SEALs had been trapped and abandoned, but the determination of a few individuals to never leave anyone behind had saved 11 lives. Whether they would all survive the next few minutes remained to be seen, but Lieutenant Commander Morrison and his team were no longer alone on a mountain facing execution by their enemies. They were with fellow Americans who had risked everything to bring them home, and that was what the military oath really meant. Torres managed to auto-rotate the failing helicopter into the valley, using the last of his flight controls to cushion what could have been a fatal crash. The aircraft hit hard but remained upright, with all 14 people aboard surviving the impact. As they climbed out of the wreckage in the snowy valley, Sarah realized that their ordeal was not over. They were still in enemy territory with wounded men who needed immediate medical care, and it would be hours before a ground rescue force could reach their location. But as she looked at the faces of the men she had helped save, Sarah Chin knew that she had made the right choice. These soldiers would see another Christmas with their families because a few people had been willing to risk everything rather than abandon their fellow Americans. That was worth any consequence she would face for disobeying orders and defying the bureaucracy that would have left good men to die rather than risk an impossible mission. In the end, the impossible had become possible through courage, skill, and the absolute determination to never leave anyone behind.